Tēnā koutou e ngā iwi mātaki maina. Nau mai rā ki tēnei wahanga e kia nei ko Native Minds. My name is Tainui Stephens. I welcome you to this session of Native Minds. But first I'd like to get something off my own native mind, and that is to share a few words about the passing of a dear friend of mine who lies now on his home marae. Many are travelling the country to go and pay their last respects to this man, who, for the purposes of this kaupapa and this kōrero, was an old school believer in the truth. Nō reira rā e taku hoa. Derek ko tuku toto rewa usta. Tēnei mātou ka tangi nei mau, kua hei rea hoa. Tō mātou matu I roto I te ao kawenga kōrero. Taku haumi, taku hoa, I roto I ngā tau, me ngā neke, me ngā nuku a te tangata, me ngā whainga nui a te ao Māori. O ti rāia, e ne mea katoa I o tina I a tāua, mā ngā arwatanga o te ao pāpaho. Nō reira e te hoa moe maira. Yeah. Farewell, Derek. You truly were one of the pioneer broadcasters, bringing stories to our Māori world through television. I knew you so well, Derek, and the four of us in particular, the late Ini Leonard, Whaingata, you and myself, back in the day when we planned for a future for Māori television. I remember in 1986, the what was called then the wasn't Matati, the Pacific Polynesian Festival, the Polynesian Festival. We had an OB in Hastings with the in Christchurch, 1986, and we did the OB. And at the end of the OB, you said in pride at our meeting, just the four of us, I knew I could do it. And you did do it, Derek. You brought to that role all your skills in broadcasting and knowledge of entertainment. You were one of the chosen few Māori in 1979 to enter this world. You made yourself available. You were already a skilled teacher, and you did the work. Because of you, generations of broadcasters know of the crafts of our business, know of the commitment, know of the disciplines needed to address the kaupapa. You truly were old school, Derek. Truly were old school, as a teacher, as a broadcaster, and in later years as a man of the land amongst your people. So farewell, brother. Farewell. E mihi nui atuana ki a koe, me au mahinga katoa e hoa e. Heire koe, heire koe. Whai atu koe I Ernie, whai atu koe I a whai, I a rāta katoa. Ko tu koe mai ngā ringa o tuariki ki a koe. E te tamaiti o Ngāti Maniapoto, o Ngāti Te Kanua, o Ngāti Pehi, o Ngāti Kinehaka. Kouwhia ngā kapua pauri, ki runga ki tō maunga kia pukeroa. Ko tō awa tērā ku manga pu e rere mai rā anō nei he roi mawhai e hoa e. Heire, heire, heire koe. Wā mai te aroha, kore rawai, rika, kuku rawai, taku manga wa. Kei ngā e. Ko wai tērā, huri rā, I ngā rori, ko te ke hua, hai ora, I te ao e. Ka piti hono tātai hono te hunga mate ki a rata. Ka piti hono tātai hono ko tātou e tau nei. Te hunga ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Kia hātia, e te wima, nau mai anō rā, hau mai anō rā, ki roto ki tēnei wahanga o Native Minds. E mea nei te kōrero, mai te hiri te mahara, mai ia hiri kapu, ahu atu ki te reo, ko ia tērā ko te whakakua waitanga o tēnei me te whakaaru nui o te tangata. So we welcome you to Native Minds. We welcome you to this chance to share the thoughts, the visions, and the thinking of Indigenous peoples and the worlds that they currently occupy or may obsess them or to which they are committed. We started the session with a personal yet pointed farewell to a friend of mine from the world of broadcasting, from the world of the media, and the world of stories is perhaps essential and at the root of this discussion. But it's also in the format of Native Minds to introduce our guests in a particular way. We could call this session Native Minds. In some ways it's Native Mind. It is a special show because today it's Native Minds 1+1. We're honoured to have a special manuhiri with us, and according to our kaupapa, we ask our guests to answer 3 questions. Firstly, who they are. Secondly, what is their tribe or nation? And thirdly, what they believe to be their kaupapa, their raison d'etre, why their god or gods put them among us. And I now pass the kōrero, te rākau kōrero, ki a koe te hoa, nau mai rā, tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, Tainui, e te rangatira o tira e te pukanga kōrero, e mihi atira ki a koe I roto I ngā whakahokinga whakaro, mi ki penei au ki te rao ngā rangatira ki a Derek, koe tērā kua, me ki penei au kua ngaro atu I te tirohanga kanohi. Ka tika, kia whakamihia, te nui o ana mahi e hoa, I o te ai te wā e ora ana, te wā e takatu ana I runga I te mato o te whenua, koe tērā te tahi o ngā tuatahi o te iwi Māori kia para I te huarahi mo te taha pāpāho Māori nei. Ka tika, kia tuku I ngā whakaro ki aia ki tērā o ngā kāhui tokotoru I whakahuatia mai e koe. No te mea ko rātou pēr, te tuatahitanga o te hunga, ko whai atu I era o ngā tapu wai ki te para I te huarahi mo ngai Māori I roto I te ao pāpāho. Nō reire hoe, e mihi ana ki era o ngā whakaro, I rao ngā kupu poroporo wā ki kia hoi anō ka hoki mai te wāhi. Kia tāua e hui nei, kia tātou me ki e titiro atu rā ki ngā huatanga o te ao huri. Nō reira, koe tēnei te mihi atu kia koe Tainui, me taku mōhio tonu ka tahi anō, tērā o ngā hui ahurei nui rawa o te ao kiriata, iwi take, iwi Māori kaoti, me te nui o ngā hua kua puta mai e hua, nō reira, e mihi ana hoki kia Libby, ki ngā ringa whakahaere, tērā kaupapa tāhua, hoki ngā mahara ki te wā, iau I te wārango raukawa te wā, I tū tuatahi ai, Māoriland, I roto I te ngahuri tau ki muri, ko tāua tēnei te rānei e kōrero ana mo tō tāua nei au, o tira e rā o ngā kaupapa huho o te ao Māori. Hoi anō, me tere whakautu au I hoa ngā pātai e toru, ko Meihana Durie tēnei e mihi atu rā kia koe o tira kia koutou katoa rā, te taha o tō mātou pāpā, ko rangitāne, te iwi, ko Ngāti Rangi te pae, te hapu, ko te rangi Māori e te marae, ko te rangi Māori e te take, ko mātou rā ngā uri. I te rātu taha ona, ko Ngāti Kauwhata te iwi, tahuri wakanui te hapu, ko Aorangi te marae. Ka tai atu rā ki te taha o tō mātou kōka no te tai rāwhiti ia. Hikurangi te maunga waiapu te awa Ngāti Porau te iwi, engari he pānga no hoki ki roto o rongo whakāta. Hoi anō tō mātou tawa no te waipaunamu ia, kai tu wahuriri ka te huirapa, tēnei rā te uri te mihi atu rā kia koutou. So yeah, thanks Tainui. It's actually awesome to see you again e hoa. And thank you also for opening our kōrero this afternoon, with those, I think, really important reflections on a wonderful contributor to Māori broadcasting and such a big loss for us as Māori. But I think also his loss makes us reflect on the legacy that's been left behind it. So thank you for that and for the opportunity to share some whakaro with you today. The marae that's behind me, I just wanted to share this with the viewers, is Te Rau Karamu. It's a marae that was opened last year by Whanau, which is on the Pukeahu campus of Te Kuninga ki Purehuro, just off Tasman Street there, in Te Whanganui Atara. So it's a marae it comes with a contemporary design, but it imbues a kaupapa that's all about the maramataka and the kawa ora. So I thought, look, given that we're in the season of puanga and matariki hoa and te mātahi o te tau, for those of our viewers who might have the opportunity to go to this marae and into the whare, te whai oranga o te whai ao, within the whare, there is a whakamārama about the significance of the maramataka. So look, I thought I could have gone with any picture behind me e hoa, but today it's Te Rau Karamu.
Tēnā kauru ko te whare. Bro, there's one question. Kāre no kia hakautua mai e koe. Tau kaupapa. Tau ake kaupapa.
O e tino pātai hoki tērā, tōku tino kaupapa, me ki pēnei au tuatahi rā ko te whānau. Te kaupapa tuatahi, tuarua rā, ko te hapu, tuatoru te iwi, tua whā ko te iwi Māori whānui. I think those are my kaupapa e hoa. Always have and always will be. That's kind of the world, the universe that orbits around me, and I'm a part of that universe. But I think in the time that I've been on Papa Tuanuku, my commitment has really been one to ensure that our whānau, our hapu, our iwi, our communities, our people can flourish and thrive. And if I can make some small contribution to that, all good.
It's interesting that you, in response to a question about your personal kaupapa, immediately place yourself within a continuum. And that sense of whakapapa is one of those vital, essential truths of our Māori world. And it's perhaps just a good time now to introduce our kaupapa with respect to a few words that I have with regard to the importance I feel with stories, with narratives. It's an obvious truth that as a species, the first thing we need is food and shelter. The second thing we need as a social species is each other. The thing we need after that is our stories, because our stories are the glue that tie us together. And for me, stories are simply information packaged in ways that, whether it's a 3-act structure or whatever it is in the storytelling arts, to be able to share information, because it's been well said that information or knowledge is power, and that may be so, but it's only so if it's shared. And this particular session of Native Minds is called Infodemic because recent events cannot dissuade our species really that there's trouble on the horizon, there's trouble at mill. The pandemic, if you like, and COVID in general has been an effective X-ray that's been placed over our planet, and all the things that are wrong with us are on display. I have a personal view that one of the things that is most under threat is information, and hence the coining of the term infodemic. And so in a way, this is the purpose of our particular session, Meihana, just to share our thoughts on our perspectives on what is truth, how truth is perhaps imperiled these days, the fallout from that, and what is there about our native minds, our native existence, the filters we place upon the world that can protect us from the filigree gates of hell, So, me ki pēnei tēnā koe hoa, nau mai rā ki te wahi kōrero mā te wā, mo te lipa.
Well, kia ora Tainui. Look, that's a really neat segue perhaps into one of the things that we just talked about earlier was the place of whakapapa. Because as we have experienced probably the last 3 years of a very unsettling period of time for not only whānau hapu iwi communities and Aotearoa more broadly, but the world at large, I think it really has forced us to re-examine this whole notion of truth. And from a Māori perspective as well, it's actually forced us to come back to some of those earlier discussions I think our tupuna likely had in the time of the 1918 influenza pandemic, where do we get our information from, and what do we validate as being information, and what do we accord mana to in terms of the things that we understand to be truth? And the reason I say that is because for me, the one absolute truth in my world as Māori is whakapapa. Whakapapa for me is the validation of existence, the validation of identity, and the validation of information. And as other Māori will attest, I think part of the reason that whakapapa is such a central, pivotal part of Māori identity is because it provides us with validation of identity, and it provides us with validation of historical accuracy. And we always talk about that kōrero, mā te titiro whakamuri ka kitea a mua. By looking back into our history and into our past, only then can we understand where we're going and what our future might look like. And we take these cues from whakapapa in order to place ourselves within that continuum and to recognize the journey or the hikoi that we're on in that space. So, it's been so interesting, even this year, reflecting on the events of the nation and how those have coalesced across a whole range of contexts and settings. And for me as Māori, I keep coming back to the fact that whakapapa is the validation of everything in our universe as Māori. We can't argue with whakapapa. We can't bring about another truth that seeks to supplant the names of our tupuna in history and the alliances and allegiances that our ancestors brought together. We can't do that. And such is the validation of whakapapa that it overrides anything else that might be deemed to be a truth. So for me, I find that there is absolute use in taking a conversation about misinformation and disinformation back to this whole notion of whakapapa. And I think that's what advantages us in many ways as Māori and as Indigenous, that we have this wonderful thing that we call the oral tradition. And not only does it manifest in whakapapa itself, but it manifests in motiatea, waiatatangi, waiata aroha, pātere, kai manawa, kai ora, all of those facets of our living, breathing culture, whakairo, tāniko, those are ways of validating truth from a Māori perspective. So I thought I'd bring it back to the word that you mentioned right at the start of this kōrero.
Bro, one of the things that strikes me in terms of what you've been talking about, when we talk about truths, the Western world, and for all sorts of reasonable reasons, are hung up on accuracy. And whakapapa, it's not just a matter, I love this notion of this accretion or this accrual of layers. And actually this is with reference to anything and everything from the most minute quantum space to cats to whatever. It is an ordered view of the world. Perhaps at odds with the Western scientific method with regard to accuracy, but it brings in other truths. Now, when you talk about oral traditions, one of the essentials of that is that it survives in a collective space, and that the truths in those kinds of spaces where we gather aren't just predicated on accuracy alone, but the perspectives of those truths. And the very humanity of that, in a way, is imperiled when we're down to having a hui with our devices. So could you just expand that thought in terms of delineations or understandings of truth in that collective space through those narrative traditions?
Great pātai hoa. I think you're right. The fundamental distinction between truth and accuracy is an incredibly interesting idea, because as Māori, we base our truth on the things that have come to us from our tupuna and from our forebears, but equally from our kaumātua and pakeke, and then we make sense of that in our own ways. And I like that you've identified this whole Western notion of accuracy as being potentially an impediment on our own structures and our own systems of thinking and our own ways of receiving knowledge and transferring knowledge to, our tamariki mokopuna. Because often, and particularly within the last 3 years, I think to a degree, we become unstuck a little bit when we start to talk about accuracy of information, because firstly, if we step back and think that whose information are we receiving here about things like COVID? We're taking in information that comes from a scientific realm, which is incredibly important. But to make sense of that and to find a way to transfer what we've been given into ways that make sense for us as Māori, we have to apply our own processes. And so it was no surprise that we saw a whole range of whanau, hapu, iwi community responses to the proliferation of data and the proliferation of information coming at us from every imaginable angle and source, a lot of which, as you say, came from our phones and came from websites that we, hadn't known about in the past. But I think the ability for us as Māori to interpret information is incredibly important. Behind me, you'll see this wonderful image, and it's taken at night, which I quite like, because it's a time where we're all kind of doing our deeper thinking. Usually, as you know, when you're making a film, you might be cutting it at night, and because it's a time that we're deep in this wānanga space, But the way that we receive information, let's just look at the pōwhiri structure. We bring our manuhiri and waiwai tapu through the waharoa, and we have a very, very careful ritualized protocol to make sure that the way that information is delivered to tangata whenua and the way that tangata whenua deliver back to manuhiri is incredibly carefully structured, so as not to make any assumptions and so as to ensure that kōrero, whakaaro, contentious issues can be carefully managed through a process of kōrero and wānanga on the marae Aotearoa. And sometimes I think we didn't do that so well in this time of pandemic. There were opportunities missed to really bring conversations about things like COVID, as one example, into a marae Aotearoa space that's clearly delineated to ensure that people can have their say, but equally that the truth from a Māori perspective can emerge. And once it does, we can go into the whare and then talk about other things. I think in some ways that was a lost opportunity for us to really explore the paradigm of the marae Aotearoa and the safety of the whare, and recognizing the influences of tūmatauenga and rongo and all those atua that we have.
One of the important words you mentioned there, Hai, was proliferation. And there is just so much stuff out there. But I'm intrigued by the role that ritual can play to be a filter on that proliferation and ensure the speedy access to perspectives that are worth considering.
Yeah, I think the place of kawa is underestimated often in contemporary Māori realities. Yeah. And I've done research in that space and others have, and that research just reaffirms everything we know, that there is a place for kawa, for ritual in contemporary Māori realities. And the times that we use and apply ritual, kawa, kawa whakauru tua te tumai, taututu, te kawa te whare kohanga. Each and every time that we apply kawa, we get a good outcome because there are important things at stake. Our livelihoods, our lives, our well-being, relationships, environmental engagement, those things are right, central to the place of kawa. And I still think we haven't realized the full potential of kawa in the contemporary elements of our lives now. And we've lost a few opportunities, but it doesn't mean to say that we can't reimagine kawa in ways that we perhaps haven't done before. And look, just one more comment. I think the internet is the one space where we really need kawa. We need kawa to keep our own people safe. And we need to be able to figure out, you know, how do we reapply this whole notion of ritual, acknowledging, of course, the forces and the energies of the kahui atua. What are the things that are risks for us in terms of our engagement digitally? And what are the forces from the kahui atua that we need to acknowledge or identify? And those, you know, we may not yet have found what those are, but I'm sure those are there. And it's the wonder of kawa that we have. It's about a ritual, and it's about using and applying rituals for collectives so that we get good outcomes and that we protect ourselves and our people.
The wonder of kawa. That's a really interesting, you know, just a phrase, if you like, bro. One of the things I feel about this matariki is that generally the public saw beyond the stars and the bright light installations and the day off, and I thought to myself, who has a day off these days? But I felt that there was a sense of that wonder, that wehi almost, or our society at large intuiting that there was something substantial going on here, and that this was a holiday that had something elemental about it, that there was something that was good and something that was inclusive. Do you think these are important steps to encourage that sense of wonder and humility, therefore, before tikanga and kawa?
Absolutely. You know, I listened to Professor Pautimara's kōrero at Te Papa talking about the arrival of nationhood in the most modern sense. And I thought, you know, prophetic words, because I think Po's exactly right, that the significance of that day and that night are huge, and we won't see the real impact for a long, long time. But in terms of a pivotal event where I think Aotearoa has evolved once more, we've gone through a particular waharoa now to see our place in our space in different ways. And when I say we, I'm referring probably to the wider society, not just us as Māori. We encouraged and welcomed others through that waharoa to fully understand the significance of te mātahi o te tau. You know, the thing that really kind of captured me as well about Matariki this year was that we've sent this massive message out to the world to say Indigenous observations are absolutely critical, and the world can benefit from being more cognizant about the place and the role of Indigenous peoples on this earth. So we've, you know, as a nation, I think we've put it out there, and we've said, hey, we've now got this public holiday which recognizes an ancient observation, celebration for us as Māori, but people are finally listening and adhering to the tohu that our tohunga identify during the time of Puanga Matariki. And so for me, that's a massive step forwards, and really just want to acknowledge, you know, all of those people have been a part of that journey to get us to where we are. You know, I was in Wellington later on that day, on the Friday. I've never seen as many people on the waterfront that day and that night as I did on the Friday. An incredible sign that, you know, we're moving forward and we're advancing, which is great.
Having said that, we, you and I, and others, we exist in a bubble as well. And there is a darker side to our existence. And for all the hope, and I believe you, Meihana, I think that Indigenous thinking will save this planet. And the planet is slowly waking up to that. And I think we are at the forefront. But there are many nations overseas where Indigenous peoples face real existential problems. Look at what's happening in Brazil at the moment. I mean, even within New Zealand, you know, the massacres, the mosque massacres have become a global meme for the white people who think that their race faces extinction. That's not a pleasant situation to be in, but it certainly indicates that we are part of a global community where there is a lot of hatred and fear and oppression and so forth. And notwithstanding our wonderful example, where are we vulnerable in this, most vulnerable in the society? I mean, you could look at the Trump factor, the Trumpism factor, and even the flags that were existing at Parliament and so forth. Where are the weaknesses in our own society, and how vulnerable are we to those forces? Because those forces are the true infodemic, in that they're driven by, you know, partisan bigotry or unfettered business, you know, for less than altruistic motives. So where are we most vulnerable in this country?
Oh, look, that's another great question, and there's probably several answers to that, Tainui. I think, first of all, we're vulnerable because of the way that our political structure is set up. What we sometimes call democracy is often a structure that excludes Māori aspiration and excludes matters of participation and representation. I know that we as a people have fought incredibly hard to adjust those inequities of representation in the political space, but more needs to be done. I've seen inequities in terms of local body politics, and I've seen a system that has enabled people with a bee in their bonnet to come along and, with a few votes and a bit of money, mask the Māori voice at local body level. And we have fought incredibly hard to respond to that, and we have been successful. But what it shows you, and I think what it highlights, is the inherent weaknesses sometimes of what we call democracy. Because democracy, for all of the good that can come out of it, can often, I think, work in ways that are inconsistent with kaupapa, tikanga and kawa. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, Hoa, talking about the vulnerability that we have because of misinformation in the ether. And what that does, and what we've seen, of course, in, you know, overseas, Brazil's a classic example where misinformation aligned with a political party agenda, aligned with wealth and aligned with influence, can bring a particular people crashing down very, very quickly, and the rights of a particular indigenous group can be wiped out and extinguished in the signature on a piece of paper. And, you know, that's been the experience of our people, Ngāti Kaupata. You know, my Uncle Eddie talked about this in our Te Tiriti claim, that it was Te Pene Raupatu that got us in the end. We weren't in a, you know, we went in a battle physically with the constabulary in the 1800s. What got us in the end was this thing that he had called Te Pene Raupatu, which was a couple of signatures on a piece of paper, which then gave our land over to all and sundry. So those forces that you've described, that was the reality in the, you know, 1860s, 1870s. But if we fast forward to 2022 and we look to 2023, we are sometimes at the whim of the forces that are invisible to us. We can't see them, but they are around us. And so what you've described, Tainui, I think, is the absolute reality in terms of a vulnerability of sorts.
Because the aberrant DNA of the bigot will live on.
Yeah, and I think we see that playing out right now in the US. You know, that the recent Supreme Court decision is one example of that, where someone can handpick the most powerful judges in the country, and then those decisions that are made are beyond the control of even people who've been appointed to you know, positions of political influence. So as Aotearoa, I think we need to be very, very careful that we never get to a point like that in our system where we give a small group of people absolute authority to make decisions that will impact and affect us for generations to come.
One of the advantages, it seems to me, in Aotearoa Te Waipounamu, and is a direct result of our Māori way of being, is that we have capacity to talk with each other. Yes, the rituals are there, and we have specific conversations because of that, but that sparks other discussions. And I think for the Pākehā world, their chance to communicate with each other. It may happen through clubs, service entities, and so on and so forth, but there's a way of life and a culture that doesn't enhance the capacity to have discourse and just to talk things over and to express views about truths, to search for things. Do you think that in this era where truth is so vulnerable that we could do more to actually have conversations? You go to hui, you do the do's, you're off. When really you could stay and talk about stuff. And those are opportunities that are lost, I think, and in a sense contribute in a very tangible way to the wonder of kawa at an intellectual level and also a wider level as well. Do you think we could do more to actually encourage kōrero and conversation with ourselves? Because we've got the tools there to do it. It's such a head start.
I think we place too often, when I say we, I'm talking about the wider nation, if not the world. We often seem to place too much emphasis on quantifying outcomes, and we place too much emphasis on timeframes and deadlines and milestones. But if we look back into our history, if we look back into our contemporary, engagement, often the most valuable things that come into our world are the product of a wānanga or a kōrero or a conversation amongst our own people about issues of the time. And you're right, I think too often, particularly when we get to hui, and we're good at doing hui as Māori, we know that, we do that really well. But sometimes I think we don't take enough from that particular space and setting to reset our plan moving forward. And then we sometimes, and I know this from experience, we get too caught up in how do we quantify outcomes and measures, and those things are incredibly important. But he mana tō te kupu, I think that classic whakatauki hoa, and you know this well, he mana tō te kupu is about the validity of the spoken word. And, we reiterate and reaffirm the words of our ancestors through waiata karanga, whai kōrero, our pepeha. But I think you're right that we're not quite there yet in terms of how we pull all of that through to a particular place where we can elevate the status of the spoken word and conversations to a point at which those conversations set the course of the next year or two or three or four for us. And we keep coming back to that kōrero no he mana tō te kupu.
I mean, it's one thing I remember as you talk, seeing Whina as being a woman who would just stand up and lay a cope up or down, whatever, whenever. This is always a chance to talk. Now, I just wanted to ask you a question with regard to what you see as the ongoing ill effects if we do nothing about addressing our understanding of what the truth is, or teach ourselves to be news or film or media literate. What will be the impact of these false narratives? And they're blatantly so often. And it's easy to give up because of the proliferation and to stick with your bubble and go and just crack open the headlines, the first few words, oh, well, that's interesting. Gone perhaps are the days where you just sit and listen to the news and you hear stuff that you don't expect to hear. And those matters of happenstance, as much as an interesting discussion on a marae, can be so stimulating and affect change. So what can we do to sort of ward off that? I don't know, it's a big problem. It's a big problem.
I think that's the third vulnerability of that the third vulnerability is the inability sometimes to differentiate misinformation that comes to whānau from sources that we don't know much about, if anything. And if I could just share that, having gone through this, the whole COVID pandemic, and particularly this year, here where I'm from, we've got a bit of a process happening right now, which is kind of a healing process, actually. The healing process is about acknowledging that for some of our whānau in our community, that third vulnerability that I refer to impacted quite severely on relationships, the breakdown of whānau relationships, You know, we talk about the Springbok tour as being one example where it was Whanau versus Whanau sometimes because of, you know, differing opinions about apartheid. But we saw that again with misinformation and COVID. And we are now sort of regrouping and regathering as communities here where I'm from and trying to rebuild the relationships, which I think came unstuck sometimes because of the things that third vulnerability did, which was about the fact that for some of our whānau, they were vulnerable to misinformation more so than others. And I think we've actually got a responsibility to tautoko them and to help them and to say, hey, look, you know, we're still part of the same community. We're still part of the same whānau. It doesn't change that. But we probably need to do more to make sure that the places we acknowledge as being valid and the truths that we talk about as Māori, that we use those as a strength and not a way of dividing us.
I wonder as you talk whether, because it is a movement, whether we're actually more proactive about healing, and particularly with regard to our various information deficits or, you know, faulty inputs and data, and whether we need to be a bit more proactive with that, because even just in a sense of, for me, a true sense of manaakitanga, we use the word a lot here at Māoriland, and manaakitanga obviously isn't just hospitality, but it's engaging in mana enhancing activities. And so if healing is a mana enhancing activity, do you think as a way to ward off the infodemic, we could just pay more attention and articulate the fact of healing being a necessary part of our lives, and also to get away from any sense of whakamā with regard to that?
Yeah, certainly. I think, you know, there's a couple of things. We do healing well, whakapiki ora, whakapiki Māori. We're good at using and applying rongoa to help rebuild our Māori, and as a consequence of that, to re-enhance the flow of mana into our worlds, between our whānau, to our environment. We do that well. And I think you use that term, warding off Tainui, it's such an apt term. And I know throughout the last 3 years, you know, we've often thought about that tauparapara, ko waira te tangata nei, ko wai, ko tūpea, ko rongo pea, aku matara tahi ate ki, tahi ate wānanga. That is a reference. It's a narrative actually about, you know, where are the risks out there in our world? Is there peace? Is there understanding? Or are there threats to our existence that we need to be aware and conscious about? Yeah. So look, certainly I think we have our own tikanga and kawa for whakapiki ora, whakapiki Māori, karakia being one, but, you know, the application of rongoa, we do that very well. I think there's a bit more to be done in the space of protection, and you use it to manaakitanga. It's a great question, because you're right. I think so often we go straight to the hospitality element of manaakitanga, but we don't kind of step back sometimes to think about what's in the best interests of our wider collective. Now, if we've identified that third vulnerability we're talking about is about information on the ether that's seeping into our communities and causing damage, and influencing our whānau in ways that are not conducive with Māori and mana, how do we apply tikanga to kind of fend off those things? And, you know, he kaupare, I era huatanga e tai ai pia te hangai kino ki te ao te tangata.
Well, I propose that. I've just got a question here from, well, it says Buzzy the Cuzzy, it can't be right. Oh no, it's Harry, Uncle Harry from Ngāti Haua. How can Te Ao Māori help inform our people how to trust the information that comes from any source? So it's easy for us, you know, if we were media literate and so forth, but in general, what's advice for people who, you know, for them to trust information from a particular source? What would you advise?
Well, te mihi rā ki Uncle Harry me ngā whanaunga o Ngāti Haua I Tainui rā. I think firstly, and it's a good question again, I think our people need to mediate the discussion, and our people need to mediate the information as it comes to us. And we saw, I think in the back end of 2021, You know, there were people like Rawiri Jensen, Paparangi Reid, a whole range of Māori experts who were able to take the kōrero and receive all the information, you know, receive the science, and then translate that into ways that made sense for our people. Now, the one thing that I thought is that happened far too late. And if the government had been really onto it, they would have got our experts out there right from the word go. And te rōpū whakakaupapa, mate uruta, you know, right from the start, they were saying that. They were trying to signal to the government, you know, we need to do this in our own way. Eventually, we found our way into those spaces. And you know, Tainui, I reflect on the wānanga that you and I were part of in Libby last year, here in our local rohe. Those types of things were about our own people taking the information that's out there and interpreting and translating it in ways that make sense for our people. And that's how we roll. That's what we do really, really well. So I think in answer to that question, we have to ensure that we can keep building capacity, capability of our own people to receive that kōrero and then to share it and you know, disseminate it and then pass it on.
I think you're quite right. I think we've got a fabulous growing commentariat, really. And there's some terrific writers and opinions out there. And I propose that and related. What are your thoughts? Because one of the interesting pushbacks I'm getting from our younger people is a disinterest in writing. Now, along with that, sometimes there's a disinterest in English, and there's reasons for all of this. But as someone for whom, you know, in the film world, you know, the written script is the core of everything, and just written communications is at the core of so much. Do you have any fears for our capacity to explore writing and these forms of communication as much as we should, because that will help shape the information of tomorrow in a very real way?
Te karawa atu e hoa, absolutely. I think my fear is that we become so dependent on social media and the language that is used on social media that we begin to I think we begin to underestimate the written form of language. And, you know, both te reo Māori and English, we need to be fostering the talent that resides within our tamariki mokopuna so that they are good storytellers and can share information and share kōrero in ways that are articulate. You know, if I look at the example of te panekiritanga, what that's done for te reo Māori, significant at that highest level. And of course, there's been a whole range of other initiatives, but I just use that as one example. Ngā maru kōrero, you know, year after year after year. And you know, some of my tamahine have been in that kaupapa. I've been a judge in that kaupapa. And we have an innate, extraordinary ability to use language in ways that can change our world and change our, you know, outcomes for our people. So I think we've got to be able to be good at writing, and it's a skill, it's a talent that we have to foster right from a young age. I also think that we have to use the education system in ways that haven't been so successful for our people to actually nurture and nourish that talent.
Mm-hmm. What are you, coming towards the end of our kōrero now, but I'm interested too in the greater, I suppose, influence of whether it's Christian thinking or those matters, those aspects of our life. I'm not talking about truth or otherwise, but just perceptions. What is a tikanga Māori? What is a tikanga Pākehā? There are those who send their karakia in a staunch kind of way or a Christian kind of way. I mean, I think on one level, it's fascinating that this does exist. Do you have any thoughts on how we decolonize our thinking with regard to what we understand as Māori and in our, because I think, bro, you know, this whole thing about mana, in a way I've broken it down to be divine authority made personal and passed on. And how we pass that on and what we receive, where's the mana? So that's another filter, I suppose, that we need to recover an understanding of, the filter of mana. Gosh, that's a rambling kind of question, but have you got anything?
It's a good question, and those are really useful for Karo, because I think you're right. And I'm going to bring the discussion around misinformation and truth back to that kind of discussion around biblical morality. And because I say that, because when we talk about a word like tikanga and tika, probably for 200 years, there has been sort of an influence of biblical morality around this notion of tika, that tika represents things that are right from a moral worldview and ethically correct from a biblical perspective, perhaps. Now, I think as we have re-explored this whole notion of wānanga and mātauranga Māori, and we've gone through processes of decolonization and re-indigenization and all those things that, people like Linda Smith and Tina Ngata speak about. Those are really important considerations for us. I think too, though, there is a discussion about what is wairuatanga. Wairuatanga, in my view, are sets of practices that give expression to the wairua of people and enable the flow of wairua for people in relation to the things that are important in their world. So I think as Māori, we accept that there is a broad diversity of practices around wairuatanga, but equally I think we need to acknowledge the validation of our own sources of mana, which you're right, we talk about the authority of mana from te kahui atua, and mana as well from the perspective of dignity and integrity, and mana about the potential of other people in our world. So there's a lot more discussion, I think, to be had around how we perceive and understand mana.
As a last question, and it's kind of one that's been tickling my mind, really, because it still astonishes me. For me, in the 19th century, one of the great strategic inventions of our tupuna was the tupuna whare. This mixture of wharepuni, pātaka, church space to ward off the encroaching world, I suppose, just as a place to retreat to be Māori, to be secure. Within that thinking of the embodiment of a tupuna, it still staggers me. It still staggers me. And in the 20th century, one of those great institutions that our tupuna invented was the kapahaka. In terms of that melding of European sounds and our own narratives and beats and all of that. I'm intrigued as to what this century could offer our people with regard to something as so sturdy and so secure with regard to maintaining our mana, our narratives, our collectivity, our sense of that continuum. I'm just wondering what strategic genius our people will come up with next. So my question is really not what that will be, but what do you think will be the elements that could be in something like that?
I really like the two examples of whare tupuna as a protective whakarurihau for us as Māori. And, it's no coincidence I've got that picture of Te Rau Karamu, Te Whaioranga o Te Whaiau behind me, because that is a whakarurihau for our ākonga, our students where I work, and our staff. But equally, the example of kapahaka, kapahaka is a curriculum for life, and kapahaka is a curriculum for identity. And it encapsulates so much more than we often give it credit for. It's a way of living, it's a way of understanding the rhythms of being Māori in this world, that we work on a particular kaupapa for a period of time, and we wānanga that kaupapa, and we move to a point at which we are ready. It's kind of like going from, I think, wānanga to waihanga to whakaari. That three-way process. And the whakaari part is all about reaching a particular point at which we're ready to demonstrate the validation of the things that we have accounted for in the last few months. But, you know, the question, where does it bring us to now, both now and in the future? It's a great question. I think increasingly we have seen the emergence of whānau as a critical collective for us as Māori. 1 in 4 Māori live in Tāmaki Makaurau now. And so from that, what we understand is that our whānau there won't necessarily have daily or any kind of access to other marae around the motu. So there's a gap. And how do we account for that in the way that we might bring about the next dimension of, or centrality of our focus for us as Māori? But I certainly think with the rise and emergence of whānau ora, we've started to do a lot of mahi in the space of whānau because, you know, for all intents and purposes, that kind of is where a lot of our engagement happens now, for better or for worse. But it acknowledges, I think, too, a move away perhaps from the wider, bigger scope of iwi. I think that probably, and I'd say this maybe as a final comment to Hua, that the place of hapu is sufficiently unexplored right now. We tend to think of hapu in a very traditional sense, that, you know, sub-tribes or something akin to sub-tribes, but hapu, from my understanding, are communities that share the same economic resource, communities that share the same education resource, communities that share the same sort of wairuatanga resource. And so if we think really broadly about what hapu could be, or how hapu could be redefined in contemporary times, yes, there is an eponymous ancestor of sorts. You know, I think of communities in Tāmaki Makaurau e Hoa, where there are 3, 4, 5 generations of whānau intermarried, living in the same part of Tāmaki. In effect, you know, probably a hapu hasn't been named. So if we can kind of maybe explore that, we might find the answer to your question.
And to perhaps recreate those entities with quite different infrastructures and so forth, because I think that in the post-COVID world, we need a new way of being, a new way of infrastructure. And I think myself, that would be community up, whether that's whānau or hapu. Kei noho tātou menuku tonu ki te pū o te pū harakeke, o te pā harakeke. Nā reira, ke te miha tū rā koe e taku tuakana, mou I whai wāhi nei ki te whiriwhiri e nei whakaro nui, whakahira nei, me te me hoke rā, me kore ake e nei momo kōrero, hei whai oranga mai mā ngā whānau, mā ngā karu ka mātaki mai nei ki tāu, hei weru I te pinati, kia māra mano ai te huara hei kaimua hei heki mā te wai. Nō reira kei te hoa, kei te miha tūrā ki a koe, nui te aroha ki a koe e ko, tēnā koe, e teiwi mā kia ora mai tātou katoa, he ko nā mai.
Kia ora rā e wa.